Title: The Bone-Crushing Tools of Homo Habilis. About 2.6 million years ago, somewhere in what is now East Africa, a small-brained hominin picked up a rock and deliberately smashed it against another rock. What came off was a sharp flake, and with that flake it started cutting. That moment, crude, unremarkable to look at, was one of the pivotal events in the history of life on Earth. The creature that made that cut was almost certainly Homo habilis, and the tools it produced were the first stone tools ever made. They changed what our lineage could eat, how far it could spread, and ultimately who it could become. Homo habilis, handyman, was named by Louis and Mary Leakey in 1964 after fossils discovered in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. The species lived from roughly 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago, overlapping briefly with later species including early Homo erectus. It was not large. Brain volume averaged around 600 cubic centimeters, compared to roughly 1,350 in modern humans. It retained an ape-like body plan below the neck, with long arms and relatively small stature. But its hands showed the beginnings of something new. The thumb was longer and more opposable than in Australopithecines, and the finger proportions were closer to those of later members of the genus Homo. The hand was being shaped in part by the demands of tool use. The tools themselves belong to what archaeologists call the Oldowan industry, named after Olduvai Gorge, where Mary Leakey identified and categorized them in detail during the 1950s and 1960s. The basic technique was simple but required planning and understanding. A toolmaker would select a rounded cobble, typically of lava, quartzite, or chert, and strike it sharply with a hammerstone. The impact removed a flake from the surface. That flake had a naturally sharp edge, capable of cutting hide, tendon, and meat more efficiently than any tooth. The core left behind also had sharp edges where the flake had been removed, and could itself be used for chopping and pounding. The range of tools within the Oldowan industry includes choppers, scrapers, and polyhedrons, but the sharpened flake was probably the most important. Experimental archaeology. Modern researchers attempting to replicate ancient tasks using replica Oldowan tools has shown that these flakes are surprisingly effective. They can skin a large animal in minutes. They can slice through the tough connective tissue around a joint with efficiency that even a sharp stone chip can achieve if used correctly. They are not hand axes or spear points. They are the equivalent of a knife, at a time when no knife had ever existed. The critical application was bone. Bone contains marrow, the fat-rich, calorie-dense tissue that fills the shafts of large animal bones. For a small hominin in a landscape shared with lions, leopards, and hyenas, marrow presented a specific opportunity. The large predators killed the prey. They ate the flesh, but they left the bones behind, because their jaws, powerful as they were, could not consistently crack the thick leg bones of large ungulates like wildebeest or zebra. Homo habilis could not either, not with teeth alone, but with a hammerstone and a sharp flake, it could. The evidence at sites like Flk Zinj in Olduvai Gorge is direct and detailed. Bones of large animals found at these sites carry two distinct kinds of marks. There are cut marks, parallel fine scratches left by stone flakes during butchery on bones from which flesh was being removed. And there are percussion marks, the distinctive impact scars left by a hammerstone on the shaft of a bone, the marks of marrow extraction. These two types of marks, found together at multiple sites, tell a clear story. Homo habilis was processing animal carcasses systematically, removing meat and then cracking bone to access marrow. Whether this involved primarily scavenging or active hunting is still debated. The current weight of evidence leans towards scavenging, at least initially, specifically what researchers call confrontational scavenging, in which hominins used noise, fire, or sheer group pressure to drive smaller predators like jackals or cheetahs from a fresh kill. The tactic would have required coordination and boldness, but not necessarily the planning and projectile technology associated with hunting large prey. By arriving at a carcass before it had been fully consumed and driving off the secondary scavengers, Homo habilis could access the flesh that remained and the bones afterward. What this dietary shift meant is almost impossible to overstate. Meat and marrow are calorie-dense, rich in fat, and packed with specific nutrients, particularly those needed for large brain development. The brain is the most metabolically expensive organ in the body, consuming a disproportionate share of daily caloric intake relative to its size. Feeding a larger brain requires more energy. But growing a larger brain also, over many generations, requires the kind of reliable, dense nutrition that plant foods alone in sub-Saharan Africa may not have provided consistently. The tools made reliable access to animal nutrition possible. The nutrition made larger brains biologically affordable. Larger brains made better tools and more sophisticated behaviors possible. The feedback loop that this set in motion is one of the defining dynamics of human evolutionary history. The tools themselves were not static. Sites spanning the full time frame of Homo habilis show gradual refinements in flaking technique, more controlled strikes, more consistent flake removal, a slight increase in the standardization of shapes. This is not dramatic technological change, but it reflects exactly the kind of incremental improvement that comes from learned skill passing between individuals and accumulating across generations. The techniques were being transmitted. Knowledge in the form of technique was already doing something that purely genetic inheritance could not, accumulating between generations and compounding. Homo habilis disappeared from the fossil record around 1.4 million years ago, replaced in the East African landscape by more advanced members of the genus Homo. It did not leave a direct living lineage, but it left the Oldowan industry, and its descendants inherited both the tradition and the neural architecture that made it possible to develop it further. The next stone tool industry, the Acheulean, associated with Homo erectus, showed dramatically more planning, more symmetry, and more complex manufacturing sequences than the Oldowan. That progression was built on what Homo habilis started. One rounded rock struck by another rounded rock, a flake that could cut, a bone that could be cracked open for its marrow. The whole long road of human technology has that modest beginning.